she knew exactly what to do when they came on. Usually, the Excedrin did the trick. So she went into her master bathroom as normal to start her morning routine. Haley Snow, her 15-year-old daughter, was also at home that morning, but her husband Paul had left very early in the morning. He was a long-haul trucker, and that morning he had driven 25 miles north to Bellevue, Washington. This takes place in Auburn, Washington, by the way. Washington State. So he had driven to Bellevue, Washington to load up his truck at a local Safeway. Susan had a daughter named Exa, E-X-A, which I thought was kind of a unique name, who was in her early 20s, and she had not come home the night before. She was still out with her new boyfriend, who Susan didn't really like. So while Haley, her daughter, was getting ready for school, she heard her mother's sink running, and then she heard kind of a loud thud. At first, she was worried, but then she thought, oh, my mother must have just knocked something over. But then the water kind of continued to run and continued to run. So Haley ended up going in and checking on her mother. She found her on the floor in her purple bathrobe, with her eyes open, but she was unable to speak. She described it to the 911 operator like she was sleeping with her eyes open. They rushed her to the hospital, and everything they did there didn't work, so nothing they did worked. She was having a lot of trouble breathing. Her oxygen levels were very low. They tried to put in a breathing tube. They tried to give her oxygen. They tried everything they could think of, and nothing was working. So they ended up flying her 30 miles north to a hospital in Seattle. They still couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. At first, they thought that she possibly could have overdosed on something and tried to kill herself. But a family member had checked all of the pill bottles in her home, and none of them were missing an excessive amount of pills. Also, her daughter and family members said that she was not acting depressed or acting strange in the days leading up to this incident. And her mental health had always been pretty good. Eventually, she ended up falling into a coma. The doctors also considered the fact that she got frequent headaches and thought she might have possibly had a stroke or a brain tumor. But they did like an MRI and they couldn't find anything. Another theory was that she had fallen in the shower and had a head injury from that. But there were no bumps or bruises on her, and her daughter Haley told the doctors that she never took a shower in the morning. Her hair wasn't even wet or anything, so that was not a likely answer either. So she fell into a coma and she was put on life support. The doctors eventually pronounced her struck to Bellevue, and then Susan just got ready for work as normal, so none of that was common for like a suicide. The police, of course, started to investigate Susan's past to see if there was anything out of the ordinary from her past, anyone that might have wanted to poison her, because they realized that it most likely was not self-ingested, or like she wasn't trying to kill herself, and it wasn't just ingested naturally. So they talked to her twin sister, Sarah, who lived in Colorado at the time, but had come to Washington to help with the funeral. She didn't make it in time to say goodbye to her sister, however. Sarah had kind of always been the more logical, well-behaved, down-to-earth sister, whereas Susan had kind of taken a different path. So she actually became pregnant at 16. She dropped out of high school, gave birth to Exa, her oldest daughter, and married the father, who lived on a small farm and kind of wanted to have a quiet farming lifestyle. But Susan wasn't about that life. She didn't want to live on a farm. She wanted to continue her education. She was very smart, and was driven. So she didn't want to let the fact that she had a child very young change the course of her life or what she wanted. So she actually ended up falling in love with another man named Connie. He was a lot older. He worked in oil fields. She fell in love with him while she was still with the father of Exa. She waited a year before actually marrying Connie, and they settled in a trailer park near Auburn, and they were married. In 1969, she started as a teller at Puget Sound National Bank, and she spent time in credit and then repossessions, and then continued to be promoted because she was really good at her job and people really liked her. So she moved up the ranks fairly quickly. Because Connie was so much older than her, he eventually kind of started to slow down. He stopped liking to go out. He enjoyed just staying in, being a homebody, chilling on the couch, watching TV. And Susan felt like she wanted more out of a partner. She was still young. She was in the prime of her life. So she actually ended up moving to Mexico with her daughters, because she also had Haley at the time. So they moved to New Mexico to look after her father. But Connie really took this hard. He wanted her to come back. He wanted her to come home. And he actually sent her money to move back to Washington, which she did. But they never got back together. They ended up separating and then divorcing. Her and her daughters got a place of their own. And then Susan met Paul. Paul King. He had been divorced 3 times. He was a loner, never really held down a career. He dug ditches, he did restaurant work, bar work, customer service, kind of always switching jobs, always in and out of relationships, kind cynical about life, but she actually found that to be somewhat comforting. She felt like she could kind of vent to him about her job and the stressors in her life without him judging her, and she liked it. She really liked the feeling that the relationship gave her. But other people in her life did not really like Paul because of this, and they were kind of prejudiced against him because he was blue collar. So Susan kind of made a lot more money than, well, not kind of made a lot more money. Susan made a lot more money than him. Susan made a lot more money than Paul, so he took on a domestic role at home, and got along fairly well with her youngest daughter, Haley. But Exa felt that he was too strict in his parenting and didn't get along with him very well. Of course, Paul became a prime suspect in the case because the spouse almost always does. But Paul maintained his innocence. Many became suspicious of him because of his calm demeanor when he found out that Susan was in the hospital. But he said that he assumed that she had had a panic attack, and that she would recover because she was healthy, and because she hadn't had any health issues that he knew of other than headaches, so he was just going to go to the hospital and she was going to recover. But once he found out her condition, that's when he started to look panicked, which I think is fairly normal. Police asked him about his marriage with Susan, and he insisted that they had a healthy marriage and that they hadn't actually had an argument since September 1985, when he had come clean to her about his infidelity. He claimed that they had since gotten over it, but according to Susan's family, she had not gotten over it. The woman's name was Mary, and they said that Susan harbored a lot of resentment toward Mary and Paul, and she even kept a photograph of Mary in her kitchen drawer, like her kitchen junk drawer. And she would sometimes take it out and look at it and get angry. She told her daughter that she hated Mary and that she hated Paul. But to me, that's a pretty normal reaction when you're cheated on, especially in a marriage, and especially when it kind of blindsides you. Police talked to Sarah about Paul, and she felt that Paul was a manipulative man with like nefarious intent for their relationship. Also, police noticed that Paul wasn't really acting like a morning husband. He was like going out on the town. He had changed the way that he dressed. He was wearing like Hawaiian shirts and not really looking like he had just lost his wife. Also, so Sarah went into Susan's home and said that Susan had purchased these capsules by accident. And when Sarah found them in the house, she kind of put them up on the highest shelf so that no one took the capsules. So like I said before, the police showed up at the house after the funeral, and they were having like a party, which kind of alarmed police because it didn't seem like the kind of gathering you would have after a funeral. There was like pizza going around and people were drinking, and it didn't seem totally normal. But Paul allowed them to search the house, and they found the bottle of capsules that Sarah had found, and they analyzed them that night. So of the 60 pill bottle, 56 capsules remained, and 9 of those contained cyanide. They only found 1 set of fingerprints on the bottle, and those were Sarah's, which made sense because she had found the bottle after Susan's death, and they also found Susan's fingerprints, but that was normal. When Paul was told about the capsules, like I said, he said that they bought them by accident. But he also said that he had taken 2 of the capsules that morning, which police thought either made him very lucky or made him even more suspect, because they thought he was just saying that he took the pills, or that he maybe just took 2 pills and threw them away so that he wouldn't look guilty. So eventually, the leads on Paul as a suspect kind of went cold, and they also couldn't really figure out a motive, and none of the men or people in Susan's past seemed to be suspect. The only other thing that they found was that a life insurance policy had been taken out on Sarah that left, and the will also left medication. This job was really hard on his body, and the equipment was very loud, so he would often have headaches when he got home from work. He decided to take extra strength Excedrin in capsule form, and instead of taking just 2, he took 4. Around 4:30 p.m. that day, minutes later, worked at the airport running the x-ray machine there. And since Bruce's death, she would come in completely hungover, smelling like booze. She would go out partying all night. She'd be in the clothes from the day before. She was just acting out of control. So police came to her home after she called them about the cyanide and asked for any bottles of Excedrin that she had in the house. And she had 2 bottles, one with only 8 pills and one that was pretty much full. She couldn't remember exactly where she had gotten them, but she was fairly sure that it was either at Albertsons or Johnny's Market, 2 local pharmacies or grocery stores. They had the pills tested, and 2 out of 8 of them contained cyanide. The unopened bottle, 4 out of 35 of them had cyanide. There were no fingerprints on the pills, and the pills seemed to have come from the same batch or the same source as Susan's. As far as the police knew, however, Bruce and Susan's lives were not connected in any way. So they thought that they had a mass murderer on their hands. So when Paul found out that Bruce had died under similar circumstances, he became very angry. It was very public about his anger. He felt that the police had really messed up the investigation of Bruce's death, Susan and Bruce, and he went to local pet stores and fish supply stores. He ended up at Fish Gallery and Pets, a local pet store, and the store manager confirmed that they sometimes stocked Algae Destroyer, but only when specifically requested by a customer. The manager did recognize one of the photographs as someone who frequented the store and someone who asked for Algae Destroyer by name. That person was Stella Nickell. So, this didn't make a lot of sense to investigators. They were confused as to why, like, if it was Stella, why would she alert the authorities to retest her husband's blood for cyanide? Why didn't she just leave his death alone? The death certificate had said he died of natural causes, and no one would have known any differently if she hadn't called and told them. So they didn't think Stella had anything to do with it, but they had to look into it because of the chemical traces found in the pills and the fact that the store manager recognized her. And also, they didn't understand how Susan fit into this because Stella didn't know Susan as far as they knew. But an investigation began. They did find that the Nickells were deep in debt. Just days before Bruce's death, their bank sent them a final delinquency notice on their mortgage. Stella had sent them a letter telling them that they were having marital problems and to give her time, and that Bruce was no longer involved, and that she would come up with the money if they could just be patient for a week or two. Stella had taken May 27th, 1986 off from work. By the way, that's literally my birthday, the day and the year, so that's kind of creepy. But she had taken that day off and gone shopping with a friend. They visited Johnny's Market and a Pay and Save pharmacy, where her friend remembered that Stella purchased multiple bottles of Excedrin. Between June 3rd and June 5th, Stella didn't go to work. June 5th was when Bruce Nickell died. Stella was the sole beneficiary of $76,000 of life insurance taken out on Bruce. Now, this next part is where things start to come together. She had an additional payout of $100,000 if his death was ruled accidental. So this explains why she would call the police to have them test Bruce's blood for cyanide. She wanted a new death certificate showing that his death was accidental, so she could get that additional $100,000 from the accidental death life insurance. Bruce had signed off on the accidental death policy 6 months before his death, but the signature was not consistent with his signature. It looked a lot more like Stella's signature than his own signature. Stella did say that she had signed it, and she said that she signed it because she was the one who mostly direct and consistent answers to their questions, but didn't mention the accidental death clause when asked about his life insurance, even though the police knew about it. The police asked her if her fish tanks had algae problems, and she just blurted out, "Yes, but I don't use that brand." And they had never asked her about a specific brand, so that was very suspect to the police as well. She was obviously very rattled. When she realized that she was a suspect, she did agree to a polygraph test, but she did not pass it. Again, this wasn't enough evidence to really convict her. But when Cynthia found out, Cynthia is Stella's daughter, when she found out that Stella did not pass the polygraph test, she came forward to the FBI about information that she had. The FBI was unsure whether they should believe her because they had a rough history. And there were also allegations of abuse, that Stella had abused Cynthia, and she was even arrested for it in 1969. They had kind of a strange love-hate, unhealthy relationship. But they did work together, and they rode to work almost every day together. She told them that her mother had been acting strangely recently, talking about murder, asking Cynthia about certain drugs, talking to her about death, asking how much cocaine was needed to cause an overdose, and Cynthia wasn't sure exactly why she was talking like this or who she was talking about, but she was talking about hiring a hitman. But eventually, over drinks, Stella revealed that she had been considering these options to get rid of Bruce. Why Cynthia never came forward earlier was kind of a mystery to police. But Cynthia said that she assumed her mother was just venting or just joking around. So Cynthia said that Stella started to resent the fact that Bruce got sober. She felt like Bruce was boring, but even more so, she was super stressed out about not being able to pay their mortgage or their bills. Cynthia knew they were having problems with the marriage. Stella would disappear for days at a time, on benders with the new man, and then Bruce would have to come and get her. Bruce was still very much in love with Stella and didn't want to get a divorce. Stella also did not want to get a divorce because then she would lose half of everything, and she didn't have much to begin with. So the idea of an insurance payout started to seem very sweet to her. Cynthia also told the FBI that her mother would study poison when she visited the library. One of the times she was there, she learned about the flower foxglove which grew around their home, and she actually used it to try to poison Bruce, and Cynthia knew about this. Obviously it didn't work because Bruce just had an upset stomach for a couple days. So with this information, the FBI was able to subpoena Stella's library card, and they found that she had taken out multiple books on poisons, and her fingerprints and palm prints were on the pages that talked about cyanide. So that conversations